Hey YouTube, what's up? Thanks for tuning in. Shock test for 1 to 18th Toyota Land Cruiser 80 trucks with hard body. So what we are talking about the trucks of RocHobby, FMS and EazyRC. Meanwhile, they are sold under 4 different names. There's of course first the RocHobby Katana. Has been released somewhere last year by RocHobby and FMS, maybe the same company. It is. And then a little bit later, a very similar truck has been released, but much cheaper, by EazyRC, the Patrion. That's my Patrion. It's in modification status. It's very similar to the Katana. It does have exactly the same awesome hard body, but different electronics and plastic frame rails, so that's why the price is so much lower probably. And some month ago, FMS released a video on YouTube where the EazyRC Patrion was named Patriot, so FMS EazyRC Patriot. And recently a lot of videos have been released with the EazyRC 1 to 18th Patriot, so they sent it probably for free to a lot of larger YouTube channels. However, my Patriot is not a Patriot. Mine is still a Patrion, and the box and manual, everything says Patrion, not Patriot, but it's probably exactly the same car. And short time ago, a further version has been released, and this LC80 1 to 18th does look exactly the same. It's licensed and called 1 to 18th LC80, so Land Cruiser 80, Toyota Land Cruiser 80, and it does come with a Toyota logo. And if you go to FMS webpage, you will find that now they sell most of their trucks as FMS RocHobby. For example, the super cool new 1 to 12 Willys Jeep, the small brother of the super popular 1 to 6 one, is sold as FMS RocHobby. And before, everybody already thought it's the same, because the Katana comes in the exactly same awesome packing as the FMS Atlas 6x6. So we are talking about those trucks now. And the chassis, at least of the Katana, the RocHobby Katana, is more or less a chassis of Hobby Plus CR18, also Atlas 6x6, of course, one axle more, but those chassis are identical to the CR18 chassis. Here I have a CR18, a builder's kit, and you can see this if I compare it to my modified Katana chassis. Only the drive shaft of the Katana seems to be more sturdy, larger and shiny. The drive shaft of this CR18 is matte, and so I can show you the way the shocks mount on a CR18 chassis now. Those shocks are all mounted by a 2mm M2 screw on the upper side and by a 4mm ball joint on the lower side. And this ball joint here, that's this screw, also holds the links. And this is a problem. This makes it not super easy to mount upgrade or non-brand shocks. I do have 10 different shocks to show you in my tests here now, and not all of those are easy to mount. So if the links wouldn't have mounted that way on the same screw with 2 ball joints as the shocks, this would be much easier. Unfortunately, all those trucks, all Hobby Plus trucks, even the tiny ones, the 1 to 24th ones, like this one, and all the 1 to 18th trucks, the CR18s, so no matter if the super cheap ones like this one or the expensive ones like the Kratos, they all do come with the same shocks. That's this type of super cheap shock. You will get them in red in some trucks and in black in most of the trucks. Only the builder's kit does already come with the Hobby Plus metal upgrade shocks, but all others, CR18, CR24, Atlas 6x6 and RocHobby Katana, do come with exactly the same shocks, only with different springs of different hardness. And those shocks are not really good. And in this video now I will compare 10 different shocks in the RocHobby Katana. Therefore I will take my already a little bit upgraded RocHobby Katana. You see it's without shocks here. I did already do all the tests. That's also a little bit in the status of modification. It does already have 2 driver figures inside, but actually no light. So it's even a little bit heavier now than the stock, and that's an absolutely brand new, my spare Katana. You see the sticker with stock, so that you know which one of the two that perform is the stock truck. The stock Katana, including battery, does have 493 grams, so this one. And this one with the driver figures is a little bit heavier, 510 grams including battery and 2 driver figures. Which shocks I will compare here now? First of all, which shocks I will not test. Some of you maybe will be interested. First of all, those are those shocks for WPL 1 to 16th, 1 to 12th trucks or WL toys. Those are far too large, so forget those shocks. They will not fit to the Katana. And unfortunately, I cannot compare the metal upgrade shocks for the Axial SCX24. And what's the reason for this? The SCX24 shocks do have those ball joints. This one, those balls, do only have 3.5 millimeter and not 4 millimeter. And so also the openings here are too small to get them on the balls of the Katana or CR18. And furthermore, the axial shocks need 1.5 millimeter screws in diameter and not 2 millimeter or 2.5 as some of the other shocks I will test will use. And it's impossible, of course, to mount this shock with 1.5 millimeter screws to the chassis of the Katana. And it's impossible if you take out those silver parts, those balls here. It's impossible to get them on the Katana balls, unfortunately. And those screws, legs, whatever here in the SCX24 shocks do only have 1.5 millimeter in diameter. Unfortunately, all the other shocks do have 2 millimeter or even 2.5 millimeter. So it's impossible to mount those shocks. It's even not possible simply to do it by changing the lower part of the shock to mount it on the axle of the Katana. And what you see here are 2 of those hot racing metal oil shocks for the SCX24. Those on my right side, those are genuine hot racing shocks I bought from Asia Tees, and those on the left side are super cheap ones from AliExpress. And I read in some forums those should be the same. No, they are not. The quality of those genuine hot racing shocks is much better than the quality of those super cheap copies. I don't know which brand it is. I bought them from AliExpress. But if you open the shocks and you check the screw or piston inside, you will see the difference. The real, genuine hot racing ones do have much better and higher quality pistons. You can see it here on the pictures. On the left side, the super cheap AliExpress shocks, and on the right side, the genuine hot racing shocks. Those shocks, those copies of the hot racing shocks, are sold on many different places now. I don't know if all of those are as bad as those ones from AliExpress, but these ones do by far not have the same quality as those ones. The hot racing are much smoother. And those are the shocks. I will show you the tests now in this video. A ton of testing. You can see here all the shocks. And here's a list now where you can see when the tests of all those different types of shocks start. So if you're not interested in the tests of all of those, only in few, you can jump to the right place. What I will test and compare to stock shocks. Of course, stock shocks and stock shocks with grease. Then I will test my Patrion shocks, which fit perfectly to the Katana. I will test them in stock form, I will test them with grease, and I will test them with oil. That's already filled with oil. I made a short video how to do this, similar to my Mini C oil-filled shock mod video, and you will find the link to this short video in the description. Then I will test the Hobby Plus metal upgrade shocks. Those are those ones, and I will test those in stock form with grease, and I will test those with the springs of the Katana and with Katana springs and grease. And I will test the Carisma 1/24 metal upgrade shocks, oil filled. I will test those tiny WPL oil filled upgrade shocks. I will test the Xiaomi Suzuki metal upgrade shocks, oil filled. I will test the HG18 Tiger Dog metal shocks, also oil filled. I will test the RC 4-wheel drive 1/18 Gelände 2 metal shocks, and the Panda Hobby Tetra shocks, also oil filled. And finally the Capo CUB1 1/18 Defender metal shocks. Here you can see now a list of all those shocks and the technical data. You can see the total length from center hole to center hole, and you can see the minimal length and the delta, the way the shocks can move. However, highest delta does not mean best flex or largest flex in those trucks. And what you can see, that the Panda Hobby does have the longest shocks of all, and the Carisma shocks are also longer. Most of the shocks are about 40 millimeters in length, and the Xiaomi shocks and the WPL shocks are a little bit smaller. So quite a lot to test. First, let's take a quick look at the bouncy stock shocks, which of course everyone knows. really good flex, noisy. And now let's compare the stock shocks to stock shocks with grease inside on my already a little bit upgraded Katana. Unfortunately, they don't hold grease really well, so a little bit of grease leaking. So you saw the stock shocks did not really perform well. Of course, the Katana shocks have harder springs than those. And for greasing the shocks, I simply used white grease, what I use also for greasing the gears of my tiny trucks. But grease did also not bring a real performance upgrade. And now let's check the Patrion shocks. My Patrion shocks, which I filled with oil, I tested them in stock form and with grease. Unfortunately, they do not hold grease well, so they are leaking. And of course, I tested them in my final version as oil shocks. As you can see here, the ride height of the shocks is a little bit higher. Mounting is super easy, so they fit perfectly to the Katana. And here in stock form, maybe they are a little bit better than the Katana stock shocks. but flex, here is stop now, is not as large as with the Katana stock shocks. And now the Patrion shocks with grease, leaking. No difference in flex to stock Patrion shocks. Not a huge improvement, maybe a tiny improvement as in the Katana stock shocks. Adding grease. And now the Patrion shocks oil fade, and this is a big upgrade. Check this out. Flex, no difference. Maybe even a little bit less flex. What's not that important in a scale crawler. But here you can see the difference. So, wow, what an upgrade. We'll see if those will leak or not, but since the diameter of the shocks of the Patrion is much larger than the diameter of the stock shocks of the Katana, this oil-filled shock mod works awesome, and you can remove those caps simply by screwing, and in the stock shocks there's a screw that goes straight through the cap, so oil-filled shock mod will not work. But in the Katana shocks, awesome, highly recommended. Check my video. And now let's go to the Hobby Plus metal upgrade shocks. Here they are, those ones I tested. I tested the stock metal upgrade Hobby Plus shocks with stock springs, without grease and with grease, and because those springs are far too soft for the heavy Katana body, I also used the Katana springs. Those are the springs of the Katana, and tested the shocks without and with grease. Unfortunately, a oil-filled shock mod will not work in those because my glue did not stick to the aluminum. Those shocks are available quite a time now. You can buy them one by one on Banggood, and you can also buy them on 4-packs by Hobby Plus. I got those from Asia Tees. However, they are rather expensive, in my opinion, or quite expensive for what they are, and they are not as good as many people say. I don't think they work awesome because they do not run really smooth. So if the angle is not exactly straight, they will block a little bit. You will see this in the test later of the stock shocks with the stock springs, and I'm quite disappointed of those. However, I bought a ton, and this red fits perfectly to the RocHobby Katana, but not to most other trucks. But it's super easy to remove this. Those are those Hobby Plus shocks in a 1/24 where they work awesome, and I removed the red, and this worked really easy. I simply put them in stove and barbecue cleaner for few hours, and the red came off perfectly. No problem at all, super easy. However, I guess I bought too many of those. I bought them for my Atlas 6x6, and I bought I guess 22 of those all in all. But after those shock tests now, I'm not super excited. Let's see how they perform. The ride height, of course, is the same as in the stock shocks. Maybe they even sit a little bit higher, but here they seem to sit lower, left side. So not a big difference. And those are the Hobby Plus metal stock shocks, so with stock springs, and they do not perform at all with stock springs. In the Katana it's much too heavy, and they also do not run smooth at all. They got stuck regularly. There's no piston inside, only a screw, and that's poor quality, so far too expensive in my opinion. Did you see the right stock on the right side rear as it hang? So awful. And with stock springs, no upgrade at all for the Katana. Way too soft. And now the Hobby Plus shocks with stock springs and grease. At least they move a little bit smoother and don't hang that often with grease inside. And now the Hobby Plus metal shocks with the much harder Katana springs, the springs of the Katana stock shocks. And that way they perform better, at least on par, maybe even a little bit better than the Katana stock shocks. Much better than with the springs they do come with the super soft springs. It's a pity that they do not deliver those shocks with different springs, as you get in some of those trucks. In most of those trucks you get harder and softer springs in the Atlas and whatnot. And now the Hobby Plus metal shocks with the hard Katana springs and grease. So quite a disappointment. I got my upgrade shocks from Hobby Plus, from Asia Tees and from Banggood, but I didn't see any difference. So all of those are from Asia Tees. I bought 2. They got stuck easily, and the problem in those shocks is the piston. They do not have a piston inside. They only use a screw, and as soon as that's not totally straight, they hang. What's nice, you can adjust the tension of the springs a little bit. So if you want to use those shocks, then use them with the stock shocks of the Katana, the much harder shocks, and you can play around a little bit with tension, but not too much. This won't work either. And use grease, then it's an upgrade. Maybe for sure those shocks are an upgrade because of their look. They are really quite nice, pretty, but also expensive and not really good. And now let's check the Carisma MS-1E oil-filled shocks. The Carisma shocks are large and oil-filled, and they are meant for the 1/24 MSA-1E, and you get them that way. You will have to assemble them yourself. So there's an instruction manual, and the quality and the performance is really good, but they are a little bit too large for the Katana. They do come with 2 types of those ball links, different ones for lower and upper side, upper shock mount. And the problem in those is the openings here are far too large for the 4mm balls of the Katana, so those ones, and those joints they do come with do have a diameter of a whole diameter of 2.5mm, not 2mm, but that's not such a big problem. You can use 2mm screws and 2 screws and put a little bit of shrink tube on the part you need and shrink the shrink tube, and then they will fit to those 2.5mm holes of the Carisma shocks. However, the Carisma shocks are the first in this test now which will not fit to this ball joint. So you will have to remove this part. Where is it? So you can't use this. And then you do have the problem, how do I mount the links? Because the opening of the links is of course far too large for 2mm screws, and therefore you will need those kinds of small ball joints, or however this is meant, with 2mm inner diameter and 4mm outer diameter, and use a M2 screw with shrink tube and put this, come on the screw and mount the shocks that way. Remove the original screw, the screw with the 2 ball joints, and use an M2 by I guess 14 or 16 screw. And those are not that easy to come by. I took them from other shocks, maybe from tiny rod ends. I do have a ton of those with 3mm diameter inner diameter, but not with 2mm. So I took those from other shocks to test the Carisma shocks, If you can't come by those, maybe those parts you will find in small servos or in C-hubs of small trucks would work too. However, it's not really easy to mount the Carisma shocks. When they are mounted, they work really well. What you see, even if the shocks are much larger than the stock shocks, the ride height is not much higher, a little bit. And mounting, here you can see how I did it. I also used O-rings because the Carisma shocks sit super loose on those ball parts you put on the screws. I don't know if it's meant that way, but performance is come on really good. Wow. So fantastic. But even if the Carisma springs are much larger and even delta is larger, you see that the flex is not as large as in the Katana stock shocks. Flex is not super important, but Katana shocks do have larger flex than the larger Carisma shocks. But here performance really nice. So that's a real upgrade. They perform really well, but unfortunately they are not easy to mount. Carisma oil-filled shocks, I used 600 oil to fill those. And now let's check those small shocks, upgrade shocks for the small 1/16 Xiaomi Suzuki Jimny. Those are nice little shocks, but unfortunately they are super expensive. They can be filled with oil. They are sold as oil shocks, but unfortunately they are missing the O-rings here. So I opened them here and there was a tiny O-ring missing. In all shocks there was no ring. There was no O-ring inside, so I put O-rings inside and then 300 oil, I guess, and they work nice. They do come with those parts for mounting them on the lower side and with 2mm, but again you cannot use the original ball screw of the Katana of the CR18s. You will have to remove this and again use an M2 screw by 14 or 16mm and with a kind of ball joint to hold the links. Same problem, and on the upper side it's no problem to mount those by screws, but again those holes openings are too large, so you will have to use shrink tube for your M2 screws. Price-wise, crazy expensive. O-rings missing, and performance of those tiny shocks is quite okay. I try to show you what was missing here in all 4 shocks. You see a tiny O-ring inside. I put this O-ring inside. They are very short, so the ride height is lower, but looks quite scale. So not that bad. Mounting not super easy because you will have to remove the screw with the 2 balls again and use an M2 screw and something for the links. But you see, performance is quite nice. They do have quite hard springs. So that's good for the heavy katana body. But they are very short and flex nearly nothing. Very low flex. But performance, however, is quite nice. So that's an option, but super expensive, don't come with oil and are missing an O-ring, but quite nice scale look in my opinion, but for sure not an option if you want to crawl with your katana. And now let's check those tiny oil-filled WPL shocks. Those two originally come in blue color, and again I removed the blue color, didn't work as well as in the Hobby Plus metal shocks, and unfortunately I think they are discontinued. Those are super short shocks, so I mounted them on the lower hole, or one of the lower holes on the shock mount. But mounting is quite easy, and they do come with 3 sets of springs, super hard ones, those ones, and medium ones, the black ones, and soft ones. Those are those which are on the shock now. I tested the soft and the medium ones, and they do come also with mounting parts, and you won't need those because those ball cups, those rod ends, including those ball mounts, fit perfectly to the original katana. Where is it? The screw with a 4mm ball. So you can simply clip those on. You can use the normal screw, and it's also no problem at all to mount them on the top side. You see the ride height is lower, a little bit lower than with the stock shocks of the Katana, but only a little bit, because as you can see here, I mounted the shocks on a lower hole on the shock tower. And now those are the soft springs. Those would be my recommendation. Really quite nice performance if you don't want to crawl with your Katana. Dampening is really nice for such small shocks, but flex is very poor, as expected. But with the soft springs it's quite okay. And the performance is really quite okay too. And the medium springs, so the harder ones, they are too hard in my opinion. Don't know what those super hard ones are meant for. Maybe those shocks are meant for small bashers originally, but they have been sold from Banggood as shocks for the WPL trucks already some time ago for a good price compared to many of the other shocks I show you here. With the hard springs there is nearly no flex, and hard, medium, I didn't test the hard ones, so nearly no flex. So, quite a surprise. If you are on scale and can get your hands on those small oil shocks, I can recommend those. Unfortunately, they are not easy to get anymore. Maybe on AliExpress somewhere. I don't find them in Banggood anymore. So, and next shocks we will test are the shocks of the small HG18 Tiger Dog. But I will clean up this mess here. So cleaned up my mess, new mess. Here they are, the shocks of the HG18 Tiger Dog. That's this tiny and rather expensive truck here, full metal, missing wheels because I took the shocks out, and unfortunately I did not see them as spare parts. So far I didn't see any spare parts for this small sucker, so they are probably not easy to come by. That's a pity, because those are super nice shocks. They are full metal. The bottom part is plastic, however. They are oil filled, they are tunable, and they come with everything you need. So they would come with those ball joints for the lower part, but those take only 1.5 millimeter screws, so this will not fit to the katana, those tiny screws. However, if you remove those ball joints, those cups will fit perfectly to the 4 millimeter balls of the katana links. And for the top part, they do come with those shims or whatever, and 2 millimeter screws and small shims to put on the outside. So mounting is really easy. Here you can see the ride height, nearly exactly the same as in the stock katana. And as already mentioned, mounting those shocks of the Tiger Dog to the katana is not a problem at all. And their performance, I put oil into those shocks, is really, really good. And they even do have quite a bit of flex. They are super short in their delta, their way the shocks can move, but flex is not that bad. Check this out. That's far enough for a scale crawler as the katana is. It's not as large as in the stock shocks of the katana, but all the shocks I test here do have less flex than the stock shocks of the katana. And performance wise, they are really awesome. At least on par with the Carisma shocks, but much easier to mount. So all thumbs up. I really like those shocks, and it's really a pity that they are not available as spare parts. At least I didn't see them, because mounting is so easy and quality is really, really good, and performance is awesome too. Unfortunately, not available normally. So next, let's test the RC 4-wheel drive shocks of the 1/18 gelanded 2 of the tiny crawlers, but first I again will clean up my mess here. So here they are, the 1/18 gelanded 2 shocks. I did take them from my Bronco. They come with my Bronco and my Defender 1/18 by RC 4-wheel drive, and I assume they are probably also available as spare parts. They are beautiful, and they do come with openings for 2 millimeter screws, so it's easy to mount them on the top side. However, I was not able to get this ball joint out on the lower side. I tried it with a little bit of force in one of the shocks, and I was afraid to damage this, and that's why I could not use the stock katana screw which mounts the link and the shock. Had to remove this again and to use one of those small balls for mounting the links in a 14 millimeter M2 screw. They look good, and they sit a little bit higher, so the katana will sit a little bit higher with those RC 4-wheel drive shocks, quite a little bit, than with the stock shocks. Mounting, as already mentioned, we'll have to use a screw on the lower side. Mounting on the upper side is no problem at all. Those shocks do have their springs inside, that's why they look so good. And performance wise, yeah, it's quite okay. They are not as good as the HG18 shocks or the Carisma shocks or the oil modded Patrion shocks, but they are an upgrade compared to the stock shocks of the Katana for sure. Quite a little bit of flex, not as much as in the stock shocks, but far enough, more than enough for a scale crawler. Performance is okay. Unfortunately, they cannot be oil filled, or they are not meant to be oil filled, so I only put grease in the side. So far so good. They really do look good, and if you can get your hands on a set of those for the Katana, that's for sure an option. What's a little bit strange or not so good, the ride height will be a little bit higher with those. Performance upgrade is okay, but it's not a huge upgrade. There are better shocks. And next shocks will be the Panda Hobby Tetra K1 oil-filled shocks. Again, I will clean up the mess first. Here they are, the shocks of my Panda Hobby Tetra K1. This sucker here, I have this guy, and they are oil-filled, and I didn't change the oil. I used them as they came in my Panda, and good thing in those shocks, the lower part fits on the 4mm balls of the Katana, so you can use the normal mount of the links and the shock. That's nice and easy. They go on hard, but if they are on, they move freely, and it's also not difficult to mount them on a top side M2 screw, and with those parts they do come with. I don't know if they come with those parts, but they were in the truck, so quite an easy mount. But they are large, and the Katana sits significantly higher with those shocks. You can see this here. And mounting, as already mentioned, works with the stock screw on the bottom side and is also easy on the top side. Large and bulky shocks, not super scale. And performance wise, they are good, of course. They are oil-filled shocks, but in my opinion, the Carisma and the Tiger Dog shocks performed him a little bit better. Also my custom oil-filled Patrion shocks. Flex, really good. Not as good as in the stock shocks, but more than enough. And performance is of course good. Those are super large shocks. They are oil filled. They work in the Panda Hobby what's also quite a heavy truck. So, large, big, not very scale, good performance, good rate height. If you want to crawl with your katana, those Panda Hobby shocks may be an option for you. And finally, the 10th shock type we will test now, and I will show to you now, are the shocks of the Capo CUB1 1 to 18th Defender. Let me clean up this mess again. So here they are, the shocks of the CUB1, this awesome, super expensive, full metal 1 to 18th truck. Metal body, super heavy, so the Capo CUB1 does nearly have twice the weight of the Katana, which is already a heavy truck, and therefore those shocks, which are made in awesome build quality, really awesome, but they are super hard. They have harder springs for the rear and softer springs for the front side. Those are the harder ones, and I put also the harder in the Katana in the rear side, which was probably too much. But they are too hard for the Katana, so if you would get your hands on those shocks, I don't know if they are available as spare parts, and if they are for sure super expensive, you would urgently have to change the springs, at least the springs on the rear side. They are super hard, but that's for a super heavy truck. And I filled them with grease, as the Capo manual says, and they do come with all mounting parts. They use silicone O-rings also for damping, and they do have 4mm diameter ball joints here, but the shocks don't sit firmly and they don't hold on the Katana ball ends. So again, I had to use an M2 by 14mm screw with such a small shim for the links to mount those shocks. On the top side, no problem at all. As you can see, the Katana sits a little bit higher, or sits quite a bit higher with the Capo CUB1 shocks than with the stock shocks. Mounting works perfectly, but unfortunately again, the lower mount cannot be done with the stock screw with the two balls. Performance wise, they work really well, but they are too hard for the Katana. They are meant for a truck with nearly 900 grams and with some tuning and upgrade parts, maybe even 1 kilogram. So awesome shocks, awesome build quality. It's really, they look good, they feel good, they perform in a super heavy truck well too, of course. And if you can get the hands on them, I don't know what the price would be, probably crazy price. You should change at least the springs on the rear side. So that's it. Now I showed you 10 different shocks in how many different setups? 1, 2 stock shocks grease, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 2 types of springs, 15, 16, 17, 18 different setups. And I can't show you a perfect solution. You saw the performance of all those shocks now. And what are the best shocks? There are some of those shocks which are not available anyway, normally, I think. The Capo shocks, but unfortunately also the Tiger Dog shocks, probably. The Panda shocks are available as spare parts in the Panda Hobby shop, but super expensive. The Hobby Plus metal shocks are available as upgrade, but they were a big disappointment, I have to say this, even if I bought a ton of those shocks. What are the winners? What are the winners? The stock shocks are not good. The Patrion shocks, stock and with grease, are not much better, but the Patrion shocks with the oil-filled shock mode, they performed really, really well. Awesome. We will see if they will leak one day, but wow. But this doesn't help if you have a Katana, because as far as I know, those are not available as spares actually. Would be nice if they would be available. The Carisma shocks, oil shocks, performed really, really well. They were the best or under the best. Unfortunately, they are super large, but more important, mounting is not easy. So mounting those to the Katana is quite a hassle. The tiny Xiaomi shocks, they are super hard and they are really, I can recommend those, but price crazy, 30 bucks or something. And they say those are oil-filled shocks. They do come without oil and are missing a tiny O-ring, all of those. So no bang for the buck, but if you are on scale and want to add some scale parts to your Katana, they are hard, they perform well, and I fill them with oil, they are okay. Those tiny WPL shocks with the soft springs performed quite well too, and if you are not a crawler, you don't want to crawl, only a scaler, and still can get your hands on those shocks, or maybe even to have them at home, they are easy to mount, and for a scale truck they are okay, but not for crawling. The Panda Hobby shocks are not scale at all, they are super large, they perform okay, and I guess as spare parts, I checked them on Panda website some time ago, those are really expensive. RC 4-wheel drive 1 to 18th shocks, beautiful springs inside, performance okay, ride height a little bit higher. Capo shocks, I guess nobody will buy Capo shocks for its Katana, probably they are not available anyway. And the HG18 Tiger Dog shocks. If I would have to choose one set of shocks, one type of shocks, I probably would use those, or my oil-filled upgraded Patrion shocks. It's a pity that those shocks are not available as spare part. At least I didn't see them anywhere. And the HG18 Tiger Dog, it's a shelf queen. I guess they are not sold a lot because it's so super expensive, but super nice shock. Most of you will probably buy the Hobby Plus shocks, the metal upgrade shocks. As I mentioned, build quality inside far from good, but if you use those, put grease inside and use the original stock Katana springs, the much harder springs, and then you will have good looking and a little bit better performing shocks. That's it for this video, guys. Unfortunately, no perfect solution. If you have a Patrion, try the oil-filled shock mode, and if you have a Katana and are for crawling, maybe buy the Carisma shocks. And everything else, if you can get your hands on those, try it. Thanks for watching, guys. Long video, I know. Hope to see you in the next video. I'll be back.